In my family, success was a lawyer, a doctor, a corporate VP. I was the art student, the one who wouldn't apply herself. At my sister's engagement party, my uncle patted my head and said, "Still painting pretty pictures, kiddo? When are you getting a real job?" The laughter felt like shrapnel. I left that night, my dreams a punchline. I didn't know it then, but that moment of absolute dismissal was the kindling. It took 7 years, a bankruptcy, and sleeping in my studio, but I just sold my first piece for 6 figures. The invitation to the gallery opening is in the mail. Addressed to them. Hello. Welcome to Hurt Stories. Let me tell you about the architecture of a family. In mine, it was built on a very specific, very solid foundation. Conventional, tangible, prestige-laden success. My father, a cardiac surgeon, his hands insured for millions. My mother, a retired federal judge, her voice a gavel of absolute certainty. My older sister, Eleanor, a mergers and acquisitions lawyer at a firm whose name was whispered with reverence in our circles. They were a triumvirate of accomplishment. And then there was me, Juliet, the caboose, the afterthought, the smudge of color on their grayscale blueprint. My failure, you see, was fundamental. It was a failure of imagination. Theirs, not mine. From the moment I could hold a crayon, I didn't draw houses or stick figures. I drew feelings. I drew the sound of rain as a cascade of silver-blue lines. I drew my mother's disapproval as a hard, black angular shape that took up the whole page. My childhood was a series of gently corrected trajectories. That's lovely, Juliet, but maybe join the mathlete team? It looks better for college. Your portfolio is interesting, honey, but you need a fallback. What about pre-law? Our home was a museum of their achievements. Diplomas in heavy frames. Awards under tasteful spotlights. My art was consigned to the refrigerator until I was about 12, when even that space became too cluttered. My creativity was treated like a charming, slightly embarrassing toddler phase I refused to grow out of. My dreams were pretty. My ambitions were cute. My potential was always conditional on it transforming into something they could recognize. Something they could brag about at the country club. The pinnacle of this gentle, suffocating negation was Eleanor's engagement party. It was held at the club, of course. Everything important happened there. Eleanor was marrying another lawyer. A man whose family tree was practically root-bound with judges and senators. It was a coronation. I was 26. I had just finished my MFA, was drowning in student loan debt, working 3 part-time jobs to afford a tiny studio apartment that smelled of turpentine and hope. I wore a dress from a thrift store I'd altered myself. I felt like a ghost at a feast, transparent and irrelevant. I was trying to be supportive, to be a good sister. I was admiring the ring, making small talk with a distant cousin, when my Uncle Robert, my father's brother and a managing partner at some hedge fund, descended. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, his breath smelling of single malt scotch and condescension. "And how's our little bohemian?" he boomed, his voice slicing through the string quartet. "Still painting those pretty little pictures?" He leaned in, his smile a rictus of pity. "When are you going to get a real job, kiddo? Your parents worry, you know. We all do." A small circle had formed. Eleanor looked politely away. My mother offered a tight, pained smile. My father studied his shoes. The laughter that rippled through the group wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was agreeing. It was the collective, relieved laughter of people who saw my life as a whimsical delusion, and my uncle as the brave soul stating the obvious. In that moment, I wasn't an adult with a master's degree. I was a child finger painting on the walls of their pristine reality. The humiliation was absolute. It was a cold, clear solvent that dissolved every last filament of my need for their approval. I left the party early. I didn't make a scene. I just walked out into the cool night air, the sound of that laughter echoing in the hollow place where my familial confidence used to be. I drove to my studio, a cinderblock room in a condemned-feeling industrial building. I looked at the half-finished canvas on the wall, a tumultuous, angry, beautiful swirl of color I was calling dissonance. And I realized I had two choices. I could spend the rest of my life trying to translate my soul into a language they understood, a language of salaries and titles and external validation. Or I could stop translating. I could speak in my own tongue, and let them be the ones who were illiterate. I chose the latter. But let me be clear. Choosing to become unstoppable is not a montage set to an inspiring pop song. It is a slow, grueling, and profoundly lonely excavation. It is digging your own worth out from under the avalanche of their expectations with your bare, bleeding hands. The first step was the great withdrawal. I stopped attending Sunday dinners where my work was the appetizer for critique. Have you thought about graphic design? It's more stable. I stopped sharing my victories, the small gallery show, the teaching fellowship, because they were inevitably met with, "But can you live on that?" I muted the family group chat. I created a psychic quarantine. Their words, their looks, their sighs, were a virus to my creativity. And I had to build an immune system. It hurt. It felt like amputation. But it was the amputation of a gangrenous limb to save the body. I doubled down on my work. I waited tables in the mornings, worked as a studio assistant for a temperamental sculptor in the afternoons, and painted from 10 p.m. until 3 a.m. My social life evaporated. My studio became my whole world. I was exploring a technique that combined traditional oil painting with manipulated, layered resin, creating works that had an impossible depth, like looking into a frozen moment of turbulent thought. I was obsessed. I was also broke, malnourished, and constantly on the verge of a breakdown. 2 years after the engagement party, I hit what I thought was rock bottom. My car died. A surprise tax bill cleaned out my meager savings. I had to choose between rent and materials. I chose materials. I moved into my studio secretly. I showered at the gym where I had a membership for the locker room. I slept on a camping mat under my work tables. I lived on rice, beans, and the sheer, stupid, stubborn fuel of defiance. My family, during one of our rare, strained phone calls, sensed my struggle. My father, in a moment of what he thought was generosity, offered me a position as a receptionist at his friend's medical practice. It's a good salary, benefits. You can paint on the weekends. It was the ultimate insult. A life sentence of weekends. The final, definitive filing of my passion into the drawer labeled hobby. I thanked him. I said I'd think about it. And then I went and sold the one thing of value I owned. My great-grandmother's engagement ring, a small, perfect emerald I'd been left. It bought me 6 months of runway. 6 months to prove, once and for all, if I was a prophet or a fool. That period, those 6 months living in legal and emotional squalor, were the crucible. With the pressure at its absolute maximum, something in my work shifted. The desperation fell away, and a cold, pure clarity took its place. The paintings from that time, they weren't pretty. They were powerful. They were raw nerve endings translated into visual form. I stopped trying to explain them, even to myself. I just made them. I applied for a prestigious, cutthroat artist residency in upstate New York, 100 applicants for one spot. I poured my soul into the application, submitting images of the new, darker, more complex work. I got the residency. It was a validation from a world that mattered to me. It came with a small stipend and a beautiful, light-filled barn to work in for 3 months. It was my first breath of oxygen in years. At the residency, I met people who spoke my language. Curators, critics, fellow artists who didn't ask, "What do you do?" but "What are you wrestling with?" I met Elias, a gallery owner from Chelsea who was visiting as a critic. He was in his 60s, with a face like a weathered map and eyes that missed nothing. He stood in front of one of my large resin pieces, the weight of expectation. for 20 minutes without saying a word. Then he turned to me and said, "Who hurt you?" Not in a therapeutic way. In an artistic way. The rage here is so precise. It's magnificent. He offered me a show. A small, solo show in a secondary space of his gallery. Not a promise of fame, but a door cracked open. I worked for the next 9 months like a woman possessed, creating a coherent body of work for that show. The show was called No Translation. It was not a success. It was a quiet, critical sensation. The art blog Hyperallergic wrote a review titled A Deafening Silence. Juliet Thorne's uncompromising voice. They called my work a visceral rebuke to the commodification of feeling. I didn't fully understand it, but I knew it was good. And then, the dominoes began to fall. A major art collector, known for her early eye, bought 2 pieces. A museum in Copenhagen requested one for a survey on contemporary materiality. My prices, which had been in the low thousands, crept upward. I moved out of my studio and into a small, clean apartment. I paid off my student loans. The velocity was terrifying. The pinnacle came this spring. Elias called me, his voice uncharacteristically tremulous. "Juliet," he said. "Sotheby's. They're doing an auction of seminal contemporary works for their spring gala. They want Dissonance. The one from your studio days. They've estimated it at between $80,000 and $120,000. I sat down on the floor of my apartment. I couldn't speak. The painting they wanted, Dissonance, was the very one that was on my easel the night I walked out of my sister's engagement party. The one that contained all the shattered glass of that laughter. The auction was last week. Dissonance sold for $190,000 to an anonymous buyer. My life changed in the time it took an auctioneer's gavel to fall. And now I sit here in my sun-filled quiet studio that I own, preparing for my first major solo show in a primary gallery space. The invitations were printed yesterday. Thick, creamy cardstock. Elegant, understated typography. I have a list of addresses in front of me. My parents' house in Greenwich. My sister and her husband's apartment on the Upper East Side. My Uncle Robert's office on Park Avenue. For years, I thought becoming unstoppable meant proving them wrong. It meant showing up in a Ferrari and flashing a bank statement. I thought my victory would be their defeat. I was wrong. Becoming unstoppable was the moment I stopped needing them to be my audience. It was the moment I realized their approval was a currency that couldn't buy anything in the world I was building. It was the day I traded their respect for my own. So, I am sending them the invitations. Not as a taunt. Not as a gloat. But as a final release. A formal notification in the language they understand. Engraved paper, a prestigious address, an unimpeachable event. That the person they considered a failure has built a kingdom they are not qualified to enter. They can come and stand in the room, surrounded by the physical manifestation of everything they dismissed, and they will finally have to see me, not as their wayward daughter, their disappointing sister, their bohemian niece, but as Juliet Thorne, the artist. They treated me like a failure because they could not comprehend the metric of my success. My success was not in avoiding bankruptcy. It was in surviving it and making art from the ashes. My success was not in a stable job. It was in the terrifying, glorious instability of creation. My success was not in being understood, but in becoming so fundamentally myself that understanding became irrelevant. I was treated like a failure until I became unstoppable. And the fuel for that unstoppable engine wasn't their eventual praise. It was the white-hot fire of their dismissal, which burned away every part of me that was weak, needy, and false. I don't thank them for it. But I acknowledge it. They were the anvil. I was the metal. And my God, did I ever learn how to hold an edge? Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more story like this, please like the video and subscribe the channel. Hit the bell icon to get notified.